Hi, I'm Heidi Cloutier,
And I'm Karen Robbie.
and we're trainers for the Massachusetts Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports Academy. Today we'll be discussing how to develop a continuum of responses for addressing concerning behavior. The content of this module was developed by the Northeast PBIS and the Center on PBIS. This is part one of a three-part series, and today we're going to explore the difference between minors or staff-managed behaviors and majors, which are office-managed or behavior support team-managed behaviors. In Module 2, Karen and I will introduce the use of a flowchart to communicate procedures to staff, and in Part 3, we'll look at the behavior referral process to ensure consistent documentation and responses to inappropriate behavior. You can find the information linked to this content in Sections 2B, Section 7 of your Getting Started workbook. So let's dive in. So if we think about why it's important to develop a continuum of consequences, we want to really start out thinking about a wide range of concerning behaviors that we see within our schools. So do you think that every behavior deserves the same response? What if the behavior occurs multiple times rather than just once?
Well, right, we wouldn't be providing the same response then. We also wouldn't be providing the same response to a student who comes into class late compared to a student who engages in physical aggression towards another person, or somebody who comes into late once or rarely compared to somebody who comes into class late every day.
Exactly. We want the severity and intensity of the behavior to match the consequences or response that we provide. Having consistency in our responses is an important component of establishing a positive, predictive, and safe school environment. It's important to have a well-articulated system that ensures fairness and make sure that all staff have the tools that they need to make sure that they can make decisions about concerning behavior as it arises. This is not an easy process at all, and often takes a while to develop, but it can be done. So let's look at some ways to do that. As we think about the critical features of developing a continuum, we want to make sure that we're addressing the function of behavior. So if we remember, function of behavior relates to why someone is engaging in a particular behavior, and all behavior is to get or avoid something. So for the student who's tardy to class, they might be late to class because they want to hang out with their friends in the hallway and get additional peer attention, or because they're not prepared for class. And they might want to avoid the uncomfortableness of that class. So we want to make sure that we're not accidentally reinforcing or increasing the likelihood of a behavior occurring again.
Yeah, because it makes me think of a student who starts disrupting the class because they're trying to avoid a task, but the teacher sends him or her to the office or to a timeout. Well, now that behavior served its function, right? They got what they wanted out of that behavior because the task was avoided. Therefore, the student won't see a need to change, or even more likely, the behavior is likely to increase its frequency.
That's a great point, Karen. We also want to make sure that we align our school-wide expectations and that we're explicitly teaching what the behavior we want to see is, and that we're acknowledging and reinforcing that appropriate or pro-social behavior with students as it occurs.
But then what do you tell teams and schools about students who are still making rule violations? Are people supposed to just ignore and be the behavior and be positive all the time?
No, but Karen, that's a great question. I think that's one of the common misconceptions that comes up about PBIS. I think it speaks to the importance of why we want to develop a continuum of responses. So there are certain times when it is perfectly appropriate to ignore a low-level behavior, and that is one of the better ways to change it. But we're not always going to ignore the behavior. We want to have a continuum so that we're matching the level of our response to the level of the behavior. So for example, if you have a student who is, talking over another student, we might make a nonverbal gesture to them, make eye contact, or we might even, model raising our hand, right?
Mhm.
And we might increase our response in reaction to the student's behavior. So if the student doesn't stop the behavior or escalates their behavior, then we might have a student conference, or we might even call home to a parent.
Gotcha. Oh, sorry.
So a couple of things that are really important, I think, to point out are that we want our responses to social errors to be quick, respectful, and reduce the probability of escalating the behavior.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it often makes sense to the school teams that we work with. What do you suggest telling other people who seem to think that punishment is the only way that we can get students to behave?
That's another great question, Karen. And historically, our schools have responded with punishment, right? And so, it has been a common approach that's been used in schools, but we do have ample data demonstrating that punishment without positive, proactive, and instructional approaches really doesn't change the concerning behavior, and in fact, can have the exact opposite result of what we're trying to accomplish.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, because we don't see teachers typically punishing students who are struggling to learn a new academic skill, right? When I'm thinking of kids that are learning how to do long division, they don't get punished because they are having a hard time with it. It
Absolutely.
really should be the same with students who are having a hard time with a behavioral skill.
Yeah, it doesn't lead to long-term durable behavior change or teach the pro-social behaviors. And so, I think that we want to respond, as you said, just like we do with academic errors. And we want to recognize that removing students from the classroom or the situation isn't necessarily going to change the behavior or improve the skill, right?
Right.
Um, and so we need to help staff understand what to do instead. So there are three important components of organizing building and district resources in a response to addressing some of the concerning behavior. And today we're focusing just on this first part, but we'll explore the discipline flowchart in Module 2 and the referral form in Module 3. So thinking about how many schools really struggle with inconsistent responses to concerning behavior, or they might fail to get buy-in to make some changes. And so one of the best ways to start is to begin to define what constitutes a minor or low-level behavior and what would result in a major behavior or higher intensity behavior. So when we think about minors, I tend to think of, those students that always talk over other kids in class, right? And that happens usually pretty frequently. Or you might see two students on the playground arguing over whose turn it is to use the swing. Major behaviors, though, are higher intensity behaviors, but tend to be less frequent. And so those behaviors might be aggressive or even harassment.
Mm. Yeah, and I think especially around minor behaviors, trying to get some clarity around what some of the more ambiguous behaviors are, like disrespect, is so important. Because if we were to ask 20 different staff to define what disrespectful behavior looks like and sounds like, we would probably get 20 different responses.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And we see that all the time in schools. And sometimes we see, some staff who have a super high tolerance for behaviors and other staff, that have a very low tolerance. And either end of the spectrum really results in increasing anxiety for our students not knowing what to expect, right? So we want to really come to consensus on what those minors behaviors and major behaviors are so that we can all respond consistently.
Yeah.
And so some schools use SWIS, the School-Wide Information System, and regardless of whether or not you use SWIS, this is a great resource and can be found in Appendix K with your workbook resources, and just really starts to define the minor and major problem behavior. Sometimes we can have the same behavior like disrespect, for example, or inappropriate language that is both a minor and a major, right? And so really clarifying what that looks like and providing examples will help your staff understand how to respond.
Yeah, I love using those definitions and sharing that with teams that I work with. It's a great starting point, even if they decide to alter them a little bit.
Yeah, great. And so, right, so you make a good point, Karen, that even if you aren't using Swiss, you can use these as a starting point, right? And so you don't have to necessarily start from scratch. So Karen, another great activity that I like to use with schools to facilitate these conversations is this pie chart activity, which is on page 38 in the Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide. This is a great activity that teachers can facilitate in the classroom with students to start to talk about situationally inappropriate behaviors as opposed to classifying behaviors as wrong, and really looking at setting the expectations for the context of school. So in the school environment, this is what the expectation is. And so this is what it can look like, you know, as you start to think about situationally inappropriate behaviors, classroom managed behaviors, office managed behaviors, having those conversations with students in the classroom. And then there's an example of a completed pie chart there. So just another resource for you to use within your schools. So it's important to also think about how you will action plan with your team so that you can come to consensus on those behavioral definitions and think about additional stakeholders that might need to be pulled into the process. And don't forget to document your actions on your action plan so that your team can revisit them. And if you have questions about additional resources, feel free to check these resources out and join us for part 2 and part 3 of this series. And if you have additional questions or would like additional support, please reach out to your Massachusetts PBIS Academy trainers. And thank you for engaging in this important work.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.